There was a time when words came easily to me, flowing like a river. They were my livelihood, my escape, and in some ways, my very identity. For years, I wrote novels filled with characters who loved, lost, and found redemption. But recently, the words had dried up, leaving only silence, a blank space that seemed to echo my own emptiness. And then I met Ansel. He was young, impassioned, and perhaps naive, but he saw me in a way I hadn't felt in years. What began as innocent conversations in his bookstore soon became something else entirely. I could feel the edges of my world blurring, my commitments, my identity, even my marriage slipping from my grasp. With each moment I spent in Ansel's presence, I felt both alive and on the brink of ruin. It was a line I thought I could control, a story I believed I was writing. But I didn't realize that some stories have a life of their own, and sometimes the author isn't in control at all. It was on an ordinary Tuesday when I first met Ansel. I had stumbled into his bookstore, seeking a distraction from the monotony of my days. The place was small, tucked away between a cafe and a boutique, almost as though it were hiding from the world. Inside, the shelves were crowded with books, some neatly arranged, others stacked in small towers that seemed precariously close to toppling. I was lost in the poetry section when I heard a voice behind me, soft and curious. "You're Ruth Elverson, aren't you? The writer?" His tone held a hint of reverence, a respect that both surprised and embarrassed me. I turned to find a young man standing a few feet away, his face alight with an eager smile. "Yes," I replied, a bit hesitant. It had been years since anyone had recognized me for my work, especially a young person like him. There was something about his face, open, expressive, that made me feel seen, like he was peering past the surface and into some hidden part of me I'd long since buried. Ansel introduced himself as the owner of the bookstore, explaining that he'd inherited it from his grandfather, a lifelong book collector. He shared how he'd read my early novels during his college years, drawn to the raw honesty and emotion in my characters. His words were flattering, and I found myself smiling in spite of the faint self-consciousness that had begun to settle over me in recent years. His admiration was genuine, and it felt like a balm, soothing the insecurities that had crept in as my writing had faded. The conversation flowed easily, and before I knew it, we were discussing the books that had inspired us, the stories that had shaped our lives. Ansel spoke of his love for poetry, the way it captured life's complexities in a few short lines. I, in turn, shared snippets of my writing process, the inspirations behind certain novels, even the struggles I'd faced with writer's block. When I finally left the store, I felt a lightness I hadn't experienced in a long time. Ansel's admiration was infectious, and it lingered with me long after I'd left the cozy, book-filled world of his shop. As the days passed, I found myself drawn back to that little bookstore more often than I'd like to admit. At first, it was under the guise of needing a new book, a fresh inspiration for my stalled creativity. But I soon realized it was Ansel himself that had become my muse, his energy and enthusiasm stirring something within me that I hadn't felt in years. And though I couldn't admit it to myself then, I sensed that this innocent admiration was becoming something far more complicated. I returned to Ansel's bookstore the following week. This time, there was no pretense of browsing or an excuse for inspiration. I went because I wanted to hear him talk about the world through his eyes, to feel that spark of admiration he had for my work, a feeling I hadn't felt in far too long. The moment I stepped inside, Ansel's face lit up, his eyes reflecting the same warmth and excitement he'd shown on our first encounter. We greeted each other as though we were old friends, slipping into a conversation that seemed to pick up exactly where we'd left off. Ansel's questions about my books, about the creative process, were genuine, and with each question, I found myself peeling back layers I had carefully protected. It was during one of these conversations that he began to talk about his own struggles, his dreams, and the reasons he had kept his grandfather's store open despite the challenges. He spoke of feeling trapped between the legacy of his family and his desire to forge his own path, a familiar conflict that struck a chord within me. I shared stories from my early career, times when I had doubted my own choices, wondered if I had made the right sacrifices. The intensity of his gaze as he listened was unsettling, almost as if he was searching for answers within me, answers I couldn't guarantee I had. And yet, I felt compelled to share with him, to bridge that gap, to connect over the uncertainty of our own journeys. Our conversations began to shift away from literature and art, becoming more personal with each meeting. Ansel seemed fascinated by the stories I had buried, the struggles I had rarely spoken of, and the passion I had once felt for my work. His questions were penetrating, thoughtful, probing in a way that made me feel both exhilarated and uncomfortable. I could feel the intensity of our connection growing with each encounter, a connection I was reluctant to define. What had started as a mere spark of admiration was now something deeper, something that felt strangely intimate. There was a part of me that knew I should stop, that I should walk away before this line was crossed, but another part of me, a part that felt buried for years, wanted to stay. I returned home that evening, feeling alive in a way I hadn't felt in ages, yet beneath the thrill of it was a faint sense of unease, a recognition that I was treading dangerous ground. Ansel invited me to a small literary event at his bookstore the following week, an evening gathering where he would introduce local authors and host a reading of their works. I accepted, curious to see him in a different light, to experience the world he had carved out for himself. I arrived early, slipping into the cozy space and observing as he arranged books and greeted each guest with a smile. When he introduced me to the audience, he spoke of my novels with a reverence that caught me off guard, describing the ways my characters had resonated with him, how they had guided him during his own difficult times. The warmth in his words felt like an embrace, each compliment a subtle reminder of the woman I had once been, a woman I had almost forgotten. After the event, we lingered together in the empty bookstore, the air filled with a quiet energy that felt charged, almost electric. He asked me about the inspirations behind my novels, about the sacrifices I had made in pursuit of my career. His gaze was intense, his questions layered with a curiosity that felt almost intrusive, yet I couldn't bring myself to pull away. I found myself sharing parts of my life I had rarely spoken of, stories of my youth, the years of struggle, the relationships I had left behind. Ansel listened, his hand brushing mine as he leaned closer, his touch sending a jolt through me. It was a simple gesture, a small crossing of boundaries, yet it felt like a leap. The way he looked at me, with an intensity that was both reverent and raw, left me feeling exposed. That night, I lay awake, replaying our conversation in my mind, the brief touch, the unspoken tension that had hung between us. I knew the danger of it, the risk I was taking. But something in me felt alive in a way I hadn't in years. And though I couldn't admit it to myself, I was beginning to crave the connection, the feeling that I was still desired, still seen. As my meetings with Ansel continued, I found myself keeping secrets I had never intended to hold. I told myself it was harmless, that this connection was nothing more than a passing thrill, a brief escape from the monotony of my everyday life. But the lines were blurring, each visit to his bookstore a step further into territory I couldn't quite control. I became careful around Walter, avoiding his questions, deflecting his curious glances. Our routine conversations took on a new layer of tension, my thoughts often drifting back to Ansel, to the quiet bookstore where I felt seen, understood, appreciated. I knew it wasn't fair to Walter, this distance I was creating, the walls I was quietly erecting, yet I couldn't bring myself to stop. Ansel's admiration became an intoxicating force, a secret I cherished, a world that felt separate from everything I had built with Walter. I began to tell myself that it was nothing more than a friendship, that I was merely a mentor to him, guiding a young mind through the complexities of art and life. But deep down, I knew better. With each passing day, the connection between Ansel and me grew stronger, an unspoken bond that felt both comforting and perilous. Our conversations shifted from intellectual debates to personal confessions. Moments of vulnerability that felt as though we were laying bare the parts of ourselves we had hidden from the world. Yet as the secrets grew, so did my guilt. Heather, my daughter, had started to notice the changes, the way I seemed distracted, distant. She would ask questions, subtle at first, but each one piercing through the fragile facade I had constructed. I brushed her off, assured her that everything was fine, but her eyes held a suspicion I couldn't ignore. And so, I continued, torn between the comfort of my family and the thrill of this new connection, unable to pull away from the allure of Ansel's admiration, yet haunted by the shadows of the life I was risking. It happened on a quiet evening, after hours of conversation that had drifted from books to life, from casual banter to confessions that had no place in a friendship. Ansel looked at me with an intensity that felt almost dangerous, a gaze that seemed to strip away the years, the commitments, the reality of my life. In that moment he reached for me, his hand brushing against mine, his touch lingering, warm and steady. His gaze never wavered, a silent question hanging in the air, a challenge I felt both terrified and compelled to answer. And as his lips met mine, I felt the world fall away, the boundaries dissolving in an instant of reckless abandon. The kiss was brief, a single moment suspended in time, yet it felt like a floodgate opening, a breaking of the dam I had so carefully constructed around my emotions. The thrill of it, the surge of passion, was unlike anything I had felt in years. Yet as quickly as it had happened, a wave of guilt washed over me, the weight of my betrayal settling heavy on my heart. I pulled away, breathless, searching for words that wouldn't come. Ansel's expression was filled with a mixture of longing and sadness, a reflection of the turmoil that churned within me. The moment lingered, a silence thick with unspoken emotions, and though I knew the right thing would be to walk away, I found myself unable to move. When I finally left, my thoughts were a jumble of regret and exhilaration, a mixture of desire and shame that left me feeling hollow and confused. I knew I had crossed a line, a boundary that could never be undone, and yet, despite the guilt that gnawed at me, a part of me longed to feel that rush again. In the days following that fateful kiss, I felt the weight of my secret bearing down on me, a constant reminder of the line I had crossed. I tried to resume life as it was, slipping back into the routines Walter and I had crafted over the years, but everything felt changed. I noticed the way Walter watched me, his eyes sharp with quiet curiosity, a lingering doubt that seemed to hover between us. Walter was never one to pry, but he knew me well. He noticed my distracted glances, the way I seemed to pull away, as though I were holding something back. His observations were subtle, his questions careful, but I could sense the unease growing beneath his calm demeanor. There was a sadness in his gaze, an unspoken worry that tugged at the edges of our conversations. I found myself growing defensive, avoiding his attempts to connect, to share in the life we had built together. I blamed it on stress, on the resurgence of my creative frustrations, telling him I needed time to myself, a space to think. But even as the words left my mouth, I could feel the distance widening, an unbridgeable gap forming between us. Each evening, as we sat together in the quiet of our home, I felt the weight of my actions pressing down on me. I wanted to tell him, to confess the turmoil that had taken hold of my heart, but I knew the truth would only bring pain. And so, I kept my silence, building walls of secrecy that seemed to grow higher with each passing day. But Walter's suspicion only deepened, his glances becoming more searching, his questions more pointed. And though I tried to deflect, to keep my composure, I could feel the fragile stability of my life beginning to crumble. Gwen was the one person who had always seen through me, the friend who had known me before I was a novelist, before I was anyone's wife or mother. She understood the ambition that had driven me, the restless spirit that had pushed me to create, to seek something more than the ordinary life I had inherited. It was during one of our lunches that Gwen, with her usual directness, brought up the change she had noticed in me. She watched me carefully as I tried to maintain my composure, her gaze piercing through the carefully crafted mask I had worn for so long. "Ruth, I don't mean to pry," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "But something's off. I can see it in the way you hold yourself, the way you seem distant. Is there something you're not telling me?" I felt a rush of defensiveness, a desire to deny, to brush off her concerns. But Gwen knew me too well, her intuition as sharp as ever, and I realized there was no use in pretending. I didn't tell her everything, but I admitted to feeling lost, uninspired, and that my connection with Ansel had reminded me of the passion I'd once had for writing. I framed it as a friendship, a mentorship, hoping that would be enough to satisfy her curiosity. Gwen listened, her expression softening, but her eyes held a flicker of warning. "Just be careful, Ruth," she said quietly. "Sometimes, what feels like inspiration can lead us down a path we're not prepared for. You have a family, a life here, and you don't want to lose that." Her words lingered long after she left, a quiet reminder of the risk I was taking, the life I was putting in jeopardy. Yet, even as I felt the pang of guilt, I couldn't bring myself to end my connection with Ansel. He had become my escape, my reminder of a self I thought had long faded. And despite Gwen's warning, I was drawn to him. Like a moth to a flame, unable to resist the allure of the life he represented. One evening, while I was out meeting with Ansel, Walter stumbled upon my old manuscripts, drafts I had left scattered in a desk drawer, forgotten over the years. They were stories I had started but never finished, fragments of novels I had abandoned in the pursuit of other projects. In these manuscripts were characters whose lives mirrored my own, whose struggles with loyalty, ambition, and desire felt painfully familiar. As he read, Walter noticed an unsettling pattern. The similarities between my characters and the choices I had been making, the emotions I had been experiencing in my life. Each line, each scene seemed to reveal pieces of my inner world, a glimpse into the turmoil that I had been keeping hidden. He saw his own reflection in the words, the echo of our marriage, the tension that had settled between us. By the time I returned home, he had finished reading, his face pale, his eyes filled with a mixture of hurt and confusion. He didn't confront me immediately, but I could feel the tension in the air, the weight of unspoken questions lingering between us. I sensed that he was waiting, watching, giving me a chance to explain, but I felt paralyzed, unable to bridge the distance that had grown between us. The next morning, as we sat together over breakfast, his gaze lingered on me, his silence heavy with a pain that pierced through my defenses. I knew then that he had seen through me, that my secrets were no longer hidden, and though he didn't say a word, the knowledge of his discovery hung between us, a silent understanding that we both knew couldn't be ignored. It was during one of our final meetings that Ansel, sensing my unease, opened up to me in a way he hadn't before. We sat together in the quiet of his bookstore, the walls lined with books that felt like silent witnesses to our confessions. He spoke of his past, the abandonment he had felt as a child, the betrayal that had left him searching for meaning in the lives of others. As he shared his story, I began to see a darkness in him, a need for validation that felt both familiar and unsettling. His attraction to me, I realized, wasn't simply admiration or affection. It was a reflection of his own unresolved pain, a desire to find solace in someone who had achieved the things he longed for. There was a desperation in his words, a quiet longing that left me feeling both sympathetic and trapped. I saw myself in him, the young woman I had once been, filled with a hunger for something greater than the ordinary life I had known. But I also saw the danger of it, the way his need threatened to consume us both, to pull us into a world of shadows I wasn't prepared to face. In that moment, I felt the weight of the choices I had made, the line I had crossed, the life I had put at risk. I realized that my connection to Ansel was not the escape I had thought it was. It was a mirror, reflecting the parts of myself I had long ignored, the fears I had buried beneath years of routine and responsibility. And as I looked at him, I felt a deep sadness, a recognition that our connection was nothing more than a reflection of our own insecurities, a bond built on longing rather than love. I knew then that I had to walk away, to reclaim the life I had nearly lost. The tension in my home grew unbearable in the days that followed. Heather, ever perceptive, had noticed the strain between Walter and me, the distance that had settled into our daily lives. She confronted me one evening, her voice filled with a mixture of frustration and worry, her questions sharp and unyielding. "Mom, what's going on with you?" she asked, her tone demanding answers I couldn't bring myself to give. "You're not the same. Dad sees it too. I don't know what's happening, but you need to be honest with us." Her words struck a nerve, and I felt the weight of my decisions bearing down on me, the lives I had affected, the trust I had betrayed. I wanted to explain, to make her understand the turmoil I had been feeling, the longing that had led me down this path. But how could I explain a desire I barely understood myself? The confrontation left me feeling raw, exposed, a hollow ache settling over me as I realized the full extent of my betrayal. I knew then that I had no choice but to end my connection with Ansel, to let go of the fantasy that had consumed me, to face the reality I had tried so desperately to escape. I met with Ansel one final time, the air between us thick with a mixture of sadness and resignation. He tried to convince me to stay, to keep our connection alive, but I stood firm, knowing that I could no longer live in a world built on deception. Our parting was painful, a final break that left me feeling empty, yet free, a release from the shadows I had let overtake my life. And as I walked away, I felt a strange sense of peace, a knowledge that though I could never undo the past, I had the chance to rebuild the life I had nearly lost. The weight of the truth hung between Walter and me, a silence that neither of us seemed able to break. He had read my manuscripts, pieced together the reflections of my inner life that I had hidden within those pages. I knew he hadn't yet confronted me, perhaps waiting for me to explain. But I could feel his distance, his hurt in every small gesture, in the way his eyes lingered on me when he thought I wasn't looking. One evening, as we sat in our living room, Walter finally spoke, his voice calm but tinged with a pain that sliced through my composure. "I read your drafts, Ruth. Those unfinished stories, they feel personal, too close to be fiction." I didn't respond at first, unable to find the words to explain the turmoil that had driven me, the desire that had clouded my judgment. But Walter deserved the truth, and though it hurt, I forced myself to confess, to explain how lost I had felt, how my connection with Ansel had felt like a spark of life in a world that had grown dull and gray. Walter listened, his face expressionless, his gaze fixed on some distant point as I spoke. When I finished, a heavy silence settled between us, the air thick with the weight of betrayal. He didn't respond immediately, and when he finally did, his words were measured, controlled, a testament to the pain he was holding back. "I didn't know you felt this way, Ruth," he said quietly, his tone filled with a sadness that left me feeling hollow. "But I wish you had told me. I wish you'd trusted me enough to let me in." His words cut deeper than I had expected, a reminder of the distance I had created, the trust I had so carelessly betrayed. And though he didn't raise his voice, didn't lash out in anger, the quiet disappointment in his eyes was more painful than any argument we could have had. In that moment, I realized the full extent of what I had put at risk, the life we had built, the love that had once sustained us, now fractured by secrets I couldn't take back. In the quiet aftermath of my choices, I turned to my writing, the one constant in my life that had remained untouched by the chaos I had created. I poured my emotions into the pages, each word a reflection of the guilt, the regret, the hope that lingered within me. My connection with Ansel, my betrayal of Walter, the life I had nearly thrown away. It all became the foundation of a new story, a novel that was both painful and healing to write. As I wrote, I felt a sense of purpose returning, a passion that I had long thought lost. The process was cathartic, each sentence a release, a way of confronting the parts of myself I had kept hidden, the emotions I had buried beneath years of routine and responsibility. I wrote with a raw honesty, a vulnerability that felt both terrifying and freeing, as though I were laying bare the secrets of my own soul. The novel became more than a story. It became a testament to the journey I had taken, the mistakes I had made, the lessons I had learned. It was a way of reclaiming my identity, of finding strength in the face of regret, of rebuilding the life I had nearly lost. And as I wrote, I felt a quiet pride, a recognition that though my past was filled with flaws, my future was mine to shape. Walter supported my writing, his quiet presence a source of comfort as I poured myself into the work. He read the early drafts, his feedback both encouraging and honest, his words a reminder of the connection we were slowly rebuilding. And with each page, I felt the distance between us shrinking, a bridge forming between the person I had been and the person I was becoming. Months later, as I looked back on the choices I had made, I felt a strange mixture of sorrow and gratitude. My connection with Ansel, as destructive as it had been, had forced me to confront the parts of myself I had ignored, the fears and insecurities I had buried beneath the comfort of routine. It had been a painful journey, filled with loss and regret, but it had also led me to a place of understanding, a knowledge of who I truly was. Walter and I had found a new rhythm, a quiet partnership that spoke of resilience, of forgiveness. Our marriage, though scarred, had taken on a depth I hadn't anticipated, a strength forged in the fires of betrayal and redemption. And though the pain of my actions lingered, there was a sense of peace, a recognition that we had both grown, that our love had survived the storm. Heather, too, had found her own way forward, her relationship with me deepening in ways I hadn't expected. She had seen my flaws, my weaknesses, and yet she had remained by my side. Her forgiveness a source of strength, a reminder that I was more than my mistakes. The novel I had written was complete, a story born from the ashes of my own experiences, a reflection of the life I had reclaimed. It was a testament to my journey, a reminder of the choices I had made, the lessons I had learned, and the strength I had found within myself. As I looked to the future, I felt a quiet hope, a knowledge that though my past was imperfect, my future was filled with possibility. I had made mistakes, yes, but I had also found forgiveness, a chance to rebuild, to create something beautiful from the broken pieces of my life. In the stillness of the evening, as I sat by the window, I felt a sense of closure, a peace that came from knowing I had faced my demons, reclaimed my purpose, and found my way back to the life I had nearly lost. And as the sun set over the horizon, I felt ready to embrace whatever lay ahead, a wiser, stronger woman who had learned the true meaning of love, forgiveness, and self-discovery. I wasn't expecting anyone to be home that night. The house was quiet, dimly lit by the warm glow of a few scattered lamps, and the rain outside pattered softly against the windows. I had poured myself a glass of wine, something rich and red, and settled into the solitude of my room, a rare indulgence these days. Loneliness has a way of creeping in when you least expect it, doesn't it? My husband, Richard, was away on another one of his business trips, something I'd long since grown used to. But this time, I wasn't just lonely, I felt restless, on edge in a way I couldn't quite name. It was an ache that no amount of self-control could quiet. So, I made a choice. A private one. Something to fill the void, even if only for a little while. I had just begun when I heard the faintest noise outside my door. At first, I thought it was the wind rattling the old frame, or perhaps the house settling, as it often did. But then I heard it again. Footsteps. My pulse quickened, but I told myself it was nothing. My stepson Ethan had mentioned going out with friends earlier. There was no reason to think he'd come back so soon. And yet, I froze when I heard his voice, soft but close. "Margot, are you okay in there?" Panic swept over me. The room was dark except for the faint flicker of the TV screen. I fumbled with the remote, trying to switch it off, but my hands betrayed me, trembling with urgency. The sound, the unmistakable damning sound, echoed louder than ever. "Margot?" His voice came again, closer this time. Before I could find the words to send him away, the door creaked open. I hadn't locked it. There he was, standing in the doorway, his eyes wide with surprise. For a moment, neither of us moved, caught in a web of shock and embarrassment. I don't know what I expected him to do. Turn away, laugh, maybe even say something cutting. But what I saw in his expression was something else entirely. Curiosity. I thought something was wrong, he stammered, his gaze flickering between me and the screen before darting away. "It's not." My voice faltered. "It's not what it looks like." Except it was. My face burned as I scrambled for an excuse, but the words didn't come. The tension in the room was suffocating, like a fragile thread pulled taut and ready to snap. Finally, he cleared his throat and muttered, I should go." But he didn't. Instead, he lingered for just a moment longer, as though he couldn't bring himself to look away. And in that instant, something shifted. It wasn't just the embarrassment or the awkwardness. It was the unspoken understanding that neither of us would forget what had just happened. When the door finally closed and I was alone again, I sat there in silence, the wine glass still clutched in my hand. My heart pounded in my chest, not from fear but from something deeper, something I didn't want to name. That night, I told myself it was just a mistake. A fluke. But deep down, I knew better. Some lines, once crossed, can never be redrawn. And this was only the beginning. When Ethan moved back home, I expected the same reserved, distant boy I had met years ago when Richard and I married. But at 25, he wasn't a boy anymore. He had a quiet confidence about him now, an easy charm that I hadn't noticed before. He'd grown into himself, and though I told myself it was inappropriate to notice such things, I couldn't help but feel a pang of awareness whenever he was around. That awareness gnawed at me after our first encounter. It wasn't just the embarrassment of him catching me in such a vulnerable moment, it was the look in his eyes, the curiosity, the way he hesitated, as though something about what he'd seen intrigued him as much as it mortified him. I avoided him for the next few days, retreating into the kitchen when I heard his footsteps or pretending to be busy in the garden. But Ethan, it seemed, was determined to bridge the awkwardness. One evening, he knocked on the kitchen door as I was washing dishes. "Hey," he said, leaning casually against the frame. "I didn't mean to scare you the other night." I kept my eyes fixed on the suds, the warm water a welcome distraction. "It's fine. I should have locked the door." "You don't have to explain," he said quickly. Everyone deserves their privacy." There was a beat of silence before he added, "But you seemed upset. Are you okay?" The question caught me off guard. It had been years since someone had asked me that, really asked, as though they cared about the answer. Richard was often too preoccupied with work, and I'd long since learned to bury my feelings under the veneer of a perfect wife. "I'm fine," I said too quickly. Then, softening, I added, "Thank you for asking." He nodded but didn't move. His presence filled the small kitchen, and I felt the air between us shift, charged with something unspoken. The tension didn't break. It lingered, wrapping around us in subtle, insidious ways. Over the next few weeks, Ethan and I fell into a strange rhythm. He was attentive in ways Richard had never been. He'd offer to help me with small tasks, bringing in groceries, fixing a leaky faucet, or even just sitting with me on the porch as the sun set. One evening, as we shared a bottle of wine on the back deck, he surprised me with a question. "Do you ever get lonely, Margot?" I paused, the glass halfway to my lips. "What do you mean?" Richard's gone a lot, and it seems like you don't have many people to talk to." His words struck a nerve I didn't know I had. "That's not true," I said more defensively than I intended. Ethan shrugged, his gaze steady. I'm just saying, I'm here if you ever need someone to talk to, or not talk to, whatever you need. There was something disarming about his honesty. It wasn't pity, it was understanding. It happened again late one night. I had gone downstairs to fetch a glass of water, only to find Ethan sitting in the living room, illuminated by the glow of the TV. He looked up as I entered, his expression softening when he saw me. Couldn't sleep? He asked. I shook my head. You? Not really? Want to join me? I hesitated but finally sank into the chair across from him. The silence between us was comfortable at first, but then he turned off the TV and leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. About the other night, he began, his voice low. I tensed. Ethan, we don't need to talk about that. Maybe not, he agreed, but I can't stop thinking about it. My breath caught. Ethan. He stood then, crossing the room to sit on the edge of the coffee table, inches from me. I'm not trying to make you uncomfortable, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. But I think you feel it too. The weight of his words hung between us, undeniable and terrifying. I opened my mouth to protest, to tell him he was wrong, but the truth betrayed me. I couldn't deny it anymore. That night was the first time we crossed the line. It wasn't planned, and it wasn't logical, but it was inevitable. The days that followed were a blur of stolen moments and whispered promises. We told ourselves it was just a fling, something fleeting to fill the emptiness. But the more time we spent together, the harder it became to pretend it wasn't something deeper. Ethan was intoxicating in a way I hadn't experienced in years. He made me feel seen, alive, and desired, but with every secret touch and lingering glance, the risk grew. Richard was due home in a few weeks, and though we were careful, the strain of secrecy began to wear on both of us. One afternoon, as we were returning from a discreet outing to a nearby park, we were caught off guard by an unexpected visitor, Naomi, Ethan's ex-girlfriend. She stood on the front porch, her arms crossed and a sly smile playing on her lips. Ethan, she drawled. Long time no see. Her eyes flicked to me, lingering just a second too long. I felt an uneasy chill creep down my spine. Naomi, Ethan said, his tone carefully neutral. What are you doing here? Oh, just thought I'd stop by, she said sweetly, though her expression betrayed her ulterior motives. I've been thinking about you a lot lately. As she spoke, her gaze shifted between us, and I knew. Somehow, she knew. This marked the beginning of our unraveling. Naomi's presence was a threat neither of us had anticipated, and her cunning was sharper than either of us realized. She had a knack for prying into things that didn't concern her. And it wasn't long before she started asking questions neither Ethan nor I wanted to answer. As the stakes rose, so did the tension, and while I tried to maintain the facade of a normal life, the cracks were beginning to show. Naomi's reappearance had thrown everything off balance. She claimed her visit was spontaneous, but I could feel the calculation behind every word she spoke, every glance she cast my way. Her eyes lingered just a second too long on Ethan when she thought I wasn't looking, her smile carrying an edge that felt more like a warning. But Ethan and I tried to carry on as if she didn't unsettle us. We told ourselves she was just a distraction, a relic from his past that had no bearing on the connection we were building. Still, her arrival gnawed at me. A week later, Richard called to tell me his business trip was being extended. His voice was distant, more focused on the work he had to manage than the woman waiting for him at home. I'll be back in 2 more weeks. Maybe 3, he said, almost as an afterthought. I told him to take care of himself, my tone calm and measured. Inside I felt a pang of guilt and relief. That night, a storm rolled in. The rain came in heavy sheets, drumming against the roof and windows. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and the power flickered once before going out completely, plunging the house into darkness. I lit a few candles and tried to settle with a book, but my nerves were on edge. When I heard Ethan's voice calling from downstairs, I was almost glad for the distraction. Margot? You okay up there? I'm fine, I called back, just trying not to trip over anything. A moment later, his flashlight beam lit the staircase as he climbed up to join me. The power company said it might be a few hours. Mind if I hang out up here? I hesitated. Sure, if you don't mind the candles, that is, he grinned. Better than sitting alone in the dark. We ended up sitting on the living room floor, sharing a blanket as the storm raged outside. Ethan had brought a bottle of whiskey from the kitchen, and the two of us passed it back and forth, letting its warmth take the edge off the chill. "Do you ever wonder what you'd be doing if you weren't here?" he asked suddenly. I frowned. "What do you mean?" "If you hadn't married Richard. If you weren't stuck in this house all the time." The question startled me. "I'm not stuck," I said, though the words felt hollow even as I spoke them. Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Aren't you?" "He's never here. You don't seem happy. I don't know. I think you deserve more than this." My heart twisted at his words. I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that I was perfectly content. But as I opened my mouth, the truth came tumbling out instead. "I don't know what I'd be doing," I admitted. "Sometimes I think about it, what my life would have been like if I'd made different choices. But it doesn't matter now, does it? This is my life." Ethan leaned closer, his expression soft but intense. "It doesn't have to be." The air between us was heavy, charged with the same tension that had been simmering for weeks. I should have stopped it. I should have walked away, but instead, I let myself be drawn in. When his hand brushed against mine, I didn't pull back. In the days that followed, our stolen moments became more daring. Ethan and I found excuses to leave the house together. A trip to the farmer's market here, a hike on a secluded trail there. It wasn't just about the thrill of being together. It was the way he looked at me, like I was the only thing in the world that mattered. It was the way he listened when I spoke, the way he made me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. One afternoon, we ended up at a quiet cafe on the edge of town. The place was nearly empty, and we sat in a booth tucked away in the corner, our knees brushing beneath the table. "I feel like I'm living someone else's life," I said, stirring my coffee absently. Ethan tilted his head, studying me. "Why do you say that?" "Because this isn't who I am," I said quietly. "I'm not the kind of person who does this." He reached across the table, his hand covering mine. "Maybe you are. Maybe you just didn't know it until now." I wanted to believe him. Naomi wasn't done with us. Ethan had told her we were just family, that there was nothing going on between us. But she didn't buy it. One evening, as I was returning from the grocery store, I found her car parked outside the house. I walked in to find her in the living room with Ethan, her voice raised in accusation. "You're lying to me," she said. "I can see it all over your face." "Naomi, you're being ridiculous," Ethan said, his tone calm but firm. Her gaze snapped to me as I entered. "You're part of this, aren't you? What's going on between you two?" I forced myself to stay calm. "Naomi, this isn't appropriate." "Oh, I think it's very appropriate," she said, her voice dripping with venom. "You think I don't know what's going on? I've seen the way you look at each other. Do you really think you can keep this a secret?" My heart pounded, but I refused to let her see me falter. "You're mistaken," I said evenly. "And I think it's time for you to leave." Naomi's smile was sharp and cold. "Oh, I'll leave. But this isn't over." Ethan and I sat in silence after she left, the tension in the room almost unbearable. "She knows," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "She doesn't have proof," Ethan said, though he didn't sound convinced. "It doesn't matter," I said. "She's not going to let this go." Ethan reached for my hand. "We'll figure it out, together." His words were comforting, but the weight of guilt was growing heavier by the day. Every time I saw Richard's face on a video call, every time I thought about the life I was risking, it became harder to justify what we were doing. And yet, I couldn't stop. Naomi's threat lingered over us like a storm cloud. She didn't have proof, but her sharp instincts and boldness made her dangerous. And Ethan, dear sweet Ethan, believed that ignoring her would make her go away. "It's just talk," he assured me one evening, his arm draped over the back of the couch as we sat close together. "It's not just talk," I snapped, pushing away from him. "You didn't see her face when she left. She knows, Ethan. She's looking for a way to destroy us." "And what do you want me to do? Pay her off?" His frustration flared, but it fizzled as quickly as it rose. "I'll handle her, Margot. I promise." But I wasn't convinced. Naomi wasn't the type to be handled. Before Ethan had a chance to act on his promise, Richard came home early, 3 days ahead of schedule. I was in the kitchen when I heard the front door creak open, followed by his heavy footsteps. My stomach dropped. Ethan was upstairs, and while there was nothing incriminating in the house, The sheer proximity of the two men made my pulse race. "Margot?" Richard called, his voice rough from travel. "In here." I forced my tone to sound cheerful, wiping my hands on a dish towel as I turned to greet him. He stepped into the kitchen, setting his suitcase by the door. His face looked more tired than usual, the lines around his mouth deeper. He kissed my cheek, a perfunctory gesture that lacked any warmth. "You didn't tell me you were coming back early," I said. "Got through the meetings faster than I expected." His eyes scanned the room. "Is Ethan around?" The question caught me off guard. Richard had never shown much interest in Ethan's comings and goings before. "He's upstairs, I think," I said carefully. Richard grunted and poured himself a glass of water. "I saw Naomi's car parked out front the other day when I called to check in. What's that about?" My heart skipped a beat, but I kept my expression neutral. "I didn't see her. Maybe she stopped by to talk to Ethan." Richard nodded but didn't press further. Still, his mention of Naomi left a sour taste in my mouth. It didn't take long for Naomi to reappear. One evening, while Richard was out running errands, I found her waiting on the front porch when I came home from a walk. Her arms were crossed, her eyes glinting with malice. "We need to talk," she said. I considered ignoring her, but the determination in her stance told me she wouldn't leave without a confrontation. "What do you want, Naomi?" I asked, keeping my voice as calm as I could. She smirked. "Straight to the point. I like that." "Get to it," I said. "I want Ethan." Her words were sharp and unapologetic. "And I think you know that. Whatever, this is between the two of you, it's not going to last. So why don't you step aside and let him come back to me?" I laughed bitterly. "Ethan's a grown man, he can make his own decisions." Her smile widened. "Of course he can. But how do you think Richard would feel if he knew about your little arrangement? Or the rest of the world, for that matter?" My throat tightened. "You wouldn't." "Try me," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "All it takes is one little text. A picture here, a message there, and your perfect little life comes crashing down." That night I told Ethan everything. "We have to stop her," I said. "If she tells Richard, it's over. For both of us." Ethan nodded, his jaw set. "I'll talk to her. I'll make her understand." But when he returned from their meeting the next day, his face was pale, his hands clenched into fists. "She's not backing down," he said. "She wants money, a lot of it." My stomach turned. "How much?" "50,000, he said. "She says it's for her silence." "We can't give her that," I said, pacing the room. "She'll just come back for more." Ethan stood abruptly, his frustration boiling over. "Then what do you suggest, Margot? Because I'm out of ideas." I didn't have an answer. Desperate, I turned to my closest friend, Claire. She'd always been sharp and resourceful, and though I hated the idea of dragging her into this mess, I didn't see another option. When I told her the truth, her eyes widened in disbelief. "Margot," she said slowly, "do you have any idea how much trouble you're in?" "I didn't plan for this to happen," I said, tears welling in my eyes. It happened." She sighed, rubbing her temples. "Okay. Let's think this through. Naomi's a problem, but she's not invincible. There has to be something we can use against her." It turned out there was. Claire dug into Naomi's past, uncovering a trail of unpaid debts and a recent brush with the law. Armed with this information, we devised a plan to force Naomi's hand. The confrontation took place in a neutral location, a coffee shop on the edge of town. Claire and I waited at a corner table, the tension between us palpable. When Naomi arrived, she looked confident, almost smug. "I'm flattered," she said as she slid into the seat across from us. "Didn't think you'd have the guts to face me." "We're done playing your game," Claire said, sliding a folder across the table. Naomi opened it, her expression faltering as she took in the contents. "Where did you get this?" she demanded. "That's not important," Claire said coolly. "What is important is that we know who you really are. And if you keep pushing, we won't hesitate to make this public." Naomi's composure cracked, but she recovered quickly. "You think this scares me? I have nothing to lose." "Maybe," I said. "But Ethan does, and so do I. So here's the deal. You walk away and we won't come after you. But if you so much as breathe a word to Richard or anyone else, we'll make sure everyone knows the truth about you." For a moment, I thought she might call our bluff, but then she stood, the folder clutched tightly in her hands. "You'll regret this," she said before storming out. Naomi's departure should have been a relief, but it left behind a trail of destruction. Ethan and I were more careful than ever, but the weight of what we'd done was impossible to ignore. Richard began to notice the tension, his gaze lingering on me longer than usual. "Is something going on?" he asked one evening as we sat in the living room. "No," I said quickly. "Why do you ask?" He shrugged. "You've been distant lately, and Ethan seems different too. I just hope everything's okay." The guilt was suffocating. For a few days after Naomi left town, things seemed calm. Ethan and I kept our distance while Richard was home, speaking only when necessary, careful not to let our closeness betray us. But the unease lingered. The cracks were showing. One evening, Richard asked me to join him for dinner at a new restaurant in town. A rare occurrence given his usual workaholic tendencies. I agreed, though I wasn't sure if I was more anxious about leaving Ethan alone or about spending hours pretending everything was fine with Richard. "I've been feeling like we've grown apart," Richard said over appetizers, his tone cautious. I froze, the glass of wine halfway to my lips. "What makes you say that?" He hesitated, swirling his drink. "I don't know. Maybe it's the stress from work, but it feels like you're somewhere else lately, like your heart's not in it anymore." Guilt washed over me, but I forced myself to smile. "You've been busy, Richard. Maybe we just need to make more time for each other." He nodded, though his expression didn't lighten. The reprieve was short-lived. 2 days later, a package arrived in the mail, addressed to Richard. I found it on the kitchen counter when I came home from running errands. The sight of Naomi's handwriting on the envelope set my heart plummeting. I tore it open, my hands trembling. Inside was a USB drive and a note. "Thought you'd like to see what your wife and son have been up to." The implications were clear. Panic surged through me as I shoved the note and USB into my pocket. If Richard had seen it first, I couldn't let myself think about what might have happened. I called Claire immediately. "She's still playing games," I said, pacing the living room. "I thought we scared her off," Claire said, her voice sharp with frustration. "So did I." "Do you think Richard saw it?" "No. I got to it first." Claire was silent for a moment before she said, "You need to destroy it. Whatever's on that drive can't exist." Later that night, when the house was quiet, I locked myself in the study and plugged the USB into Richard's computer. My hands shook as I clicked through the files. Photos, videos, nothing explicit but enough to suggest what had been happening, enough to ruin everything if Richard ever saw them. I deleted the files and crushed the USB under my heel, but the damage was already done. Naomi wasn't going to stop until she had destroyed us. The next morning, I confronted Ethan. "She's still coming after us," I said. His expression darkened. "I'll handle it." "No," I said firmly. "We need to end this for good." Ethan looked at me, his jaw tight. "And how do we do that?" "I don't know yet," I admitted. "But we can't keep waiting for her to strike." Claire came through again, digging deeper into Naomi's life. She uncovered something I hadn't expected. Naomi had been fired from her last job for embezzlement. Armed with this new information, I devised a risky plan. Ethan and I arranged to meet Naomi at a motel on the edge of town, far from prying eyes. She arrived late, her expression smug as she sauntered into the room. "Miss me?" she said, dropping her purse onto the bed. "We're done playing games," I said, standing my ground. Her smirk faltered. "Oh, are you? That's cute." Ethan stepped forward, his voice low and steady. "We know about the money you stole from your last job. We know everything." Naomi's confidence wavered, but she recovered quickly. "So what? You think anyone's going to believe you? You're the ones with something to lose, not me." I pulled out a folder of documents Claire had gathered, bank statements, emails, and a signed complaint from Naomi's former employer. Her eyes narrowed as she snatched the folder from my hands. "This is blackmail," she hissed. "It's leverage," I corrected. "You leave us alone, and this stays between us. But if you try anything else, this goes to the police." For the first time, Naomi looked genuinely shaken. She threw the folder onto the bed and stormed out without another word. The relief was short-lived. A week later, Richard confronted me in the kitchen. "Something's not right," he said, his tone cold and accusing. "What are you talking about?" I asked, feigning ignorance. "You and Ethan," he said bluntly. "I've seen the way he looks at you, and the way you look at him." My blood ran cold. "Richard, that's ridiculous." "Is it?" he snapped. "Because I don't think it is." I think there's something going on, and I want the truth. I felt the walls closing in around me. There's nothing to tell, I said quietly. But Richard didn't believe me. Richard's accusation lingered in the air, heavy and oppressive. His eyes bore into mine, searching for a crack in my defense. There's nothing going on, I said again, forcing my voice to remain steady. He's your son. How can you even think that? He didn't blink. I know what I see, Margot. Don't insult my intelligence. The tension in the room was suffocating, and I felt my composure slipping. Richard, I said, trying to redirect, if there's something bothering you, let's talk about it. But throwing baseless accusations around. Baseless. His voice rose, cutting me off. Then why is Naomi saying otherwise? My stomach dropped. Naomi? He nodded sharply. She called me, told me some things I didn't want to believe, said she had proof. I told her to stay out of our lives, but now I'm starting to wonder if she wasn't lying. My mind raced, trying to piece together how Naomi could have gotten to him. She had no proof anymore. At least, not of anything conclusive. Naomi's bitter, Richard, I said carefully. She's angry that Ethan moved on from her. She's trying to cause trouble. And you're saying there's nothing to her story? I held his gaze. Nothing. For a moment, I thought he might believe me, but then he turned and walked out of the room without another word, leaving me standing there, my heart pounding in my chest. That night, Ethan came to my room. His face was pale, his movements tense. What's going on? He asked as he closed the door behind him. Richard knows something, I said, my voice trembling. Naomi must have gotten to him before we stopped her. Ethan sat on the edge of the bed, his hands clenched into fists. What do we do? I don't know, I admitted. But if he finds out the truth? He won't, Ethan said firmly. We won't let him. But I could see the fear in his eyes, mirroring my own. The next evening, Richard insisted we have dinner together as a family. It was rare for him to make such a request, and the forced civility of it set my nerves on edge. The three of us sat at the dining table, the clink of silverware against plates the only sound for long stretches of time. So, Richard said suddenly, breaking the silence. How's the job search going, Ethan? Ethan looked up, caught off guard. It's fine. I've been looking at a few opportunities. Richard nodded, his expression unreadable. Good. I was starting to wonder if you planned on staying here indefinitely. The comment was pointed, and Ethan stiffened. It's not like I'm in your way, he said quietly. Richard's gaze flicked to me, then back to Ethan. No, but I think it's time you moved on, don't you? I opened my mouth to intervene, but Richard held up a hand. I think we've all gotten a little too comfortable with this arrangement. It's not healthy. Ethan stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. If you've got something to say, just say it. Richard leaned back in his chair, his expression cold. Fine, I think it's time for some honesty from both of you. My heart pounded as Richard's eyes locked onto mine. Margot? The room seemed to shrink around me as I tried to find the words to diffuse the situation. But before I could speak, Ethan stepped forward. There's nothing to say, he said, his voice firm. Naomi's lying. She's trying to mess with us because I broke things off with her. Richard's eyes narrowed. And why would she involve Margot in her lies? She's desperate, Ethan said. She'll do anything to get back at me, and dragging Margot into it was just the easiest way to hurt me. Richard's gaze didn't waver. And you expect me to believe that? Yes, Ethan said, because it's the truth. For a moment the room was silent. Then Richard stood, his movements slow and deliberate. Maybe it is, he said finally, but I'm not convinced. And until I am, I think it's best if you find somewhere else to stay, Ethan. What? I blurted out, unable to stop myself. Richard turned to me, his expression hard. If there's really nothing going on, this shouldn't be a problem. Should it? Ethan looked at me, his eyes filled with an unspoken question. I wanted to tell him to stay, to fight this together, but I knew it would only make things worse. It's fine, Ethan said quietly. I'll go. The house felt emptier without him. Richard seemed satisfied with Ethan's absence, though his suspicion toward me hadn't entirely dissipated. I called Ethan every day, though our conversations were brief and strained. He had rented a small apartment on the other side of town and was trying to focus on work, but I could hear the frustration in his voice. I hate this, he said one night. Being away from you, letting him win. It's temporary, I said, though I wasn't sure I believed it. but the distance was taking its toll. Just when I thought things couldn't get worse, Naomi made her final move. One afternoon, while I was out running errands, she showed up at Richard's office. She didn't have proof, but she had just enough of the story to sow doubt in his mind. When I returned home, Richard was waiting for me in the living room. "Sit down," he said, his tone icy. I obeyed, my hands trembling in my lap. "Naomi came to see me," he said. "She told me everything, or at least enough to make me question what you've been telling me." "Richard, she's lying," I said quickly. "Is she?" he snapped, "because it's starting to feel like everyone's lying to me." The room was silent for what felt like an eternity. Then he stood and walked to the door. "I'm leaving," he said. "Don't bother calling me until you're ready to tell me the truth." Richard didn't come home that night, or the night after. I tried calling, but he didn't answer. The house felt unbearably quiet, and for the first time I wondered if I'd truly lost everything. Ethan came over a few days later, his concern evident as he stepped through the door. "Are you okay?" he asked, pulling me into a tight embrace. "I don't know," I admitted, tears streaming down my face. He stayed with me that night, and for a moment it felt like things might be okay. But the damage had been done, and I knew our lives would never be the same.